And then as a reminder, please mute yourself during the presentation. You've got this by now, and then if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. And Danielle and I are going to be covering the lecture today on climate change communication and leading the discussion later in the session around step 5 and the monitoring that you did last week. And so just a quick look at the agenda today. We're really going to talk about wrapping up the course and then going into tips and tricks for communicating climate change and telling your adaptation story, and then talking about the homework and what to do as we prepare for next time. All right, so now that we're at session 6, what this means is that you've completed all 5 steps of the adaptation workbook. So congratulations, everyone. We know it's a lot of work, and we're really excited that you've made it this far, and you may have some things you still want to go back and tweak and finalize. There may be a couple things you still need to wrap up in step 5, but you should still celebrate all of the work that you've done to this point. So congratulations. And so when the course began, we outlined the 5 steps of the adaptation workbook, but what it really can boil down to is how climate change affects the resources that we manage and what management actions can help us prepare for those effects. And so at the beginning of this course, there was a little bit of uncertainty, there were a lot of questions, and you might not have been sure where to start to answer these 2 questions. But hopefully now that you're at the end of this course, you've got this. So we hope you feel that you're better equipped to really answer those questions and think about the specific effects of climate change to your project area and really start to identify those adaptation actions. And we also have evidence of your progress. So for those of you who have completed the homework through step 4, we asked you questions before you started the workbook about your ability to identify climate change adaptation strategies for your local area and to translate those into actionable adaptation tactics. And so at the beginning, there's a little bit of uncertainty. Half of you weren't quite sure, but now at the end of this course, there's been a big jump, and most of you have indicated that you feel like you can identify viable climate adaptation strategies and translate those into those adaptation tactics on the ground for your local area. And so we also have evidence of your progress that you can use through the adaptation workbook. And so you now have a climate change adaptation plan as a final product of this course. So you can download and use this plan to reference in the future, such as informing a management plan or any other documents you might be working on. And this hopefully will continue to provide you with some of the science and the research for those climate change impacts that you've been looking at for your local projects and how to translate that into your decisions behind those actionable adaptation tactics that you're choosing to implement on the ground. And so just to remind you of where we are and what we've accomplished throughout this course. So again, we really were hoping that you would use the adaptation workbook process. And so at this point, hopefully you're invested and you might consider using the adaptation workbook again for other projects as you're really thinking about climate change adaptation for your local area. And so you'll have these resources through the adaptation workshop available to you even after the course is over. And you've also been able to use your expertise and judgment and local knowledge to really apply these tools to your local project area. And you've been specifically thinking about your location, what your management goals and objectives are within the context of how much risk are you willing to take and what do you really value on the ground as you're really thinking about these climate adaptation strategies. You've also documented your intentionality behind your thinking and can refer to this as you implement your management actions in the future. And part of this course is really to create that community of practice. And so even though we're meeting virtually, we really hope that you've had a chance to talk with others in the discussions and those who are working on similar projects. There's a lot of you working on floodplain forests, and so hopefully you've been able to make some of those connections, learn new things from each other, and then provide us feedback and input on the course as well so that we can continue to improve this tool for your community and future communities who end up taking the adaptation workbook course. And so in terms of wrapping things up, We're going to be talking about climate change communication today and providing some instructions for finishing up your work in the adaptation workbook and sharing your adaptation story. And so then we're going to dive into the discussion session. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. And then we're going to focus again on monitoring and climate change communication as a part of that discussion later this afternoon. And so before I dive into the climate change communication section, is there anyone who has any questions? Cool. All right. So as natural resource professionals, we're increasingly expected to integrate climate change into our plans, our documents, and our activities. And so as we're doing this and really thinking about that implementation, there's also a need to really understand and effectively communicate information about climate change to diverse audiences that we work with, whether it's the timber industry professional who's going to be implementing the harvest that's been planned, or the small woodlot owner you're designing your management plan for, and you really want to be able to think about climate change considerations, or maybe it's the wildlife biologist who's really interested in protecting that threatened and endangered species in this NEPA plan. No matter what, it's really important for us to be able to effectively communicate why we want to implement the climate adaptation strategies that we're choosing to do. And so the first place to start is to really know your audience. And so the Yale program on climate change has surveyed the entire US, and they've taken the results of those surveys and put them into maps across the US, really showing data on beliefs, risk perceptions, policy support, and behaviors around climate change or global warming. And so you might have heard about the Six Americas study from Yale, and that's where these results are coming from. And so you'll see that most of the population is in that alarmed or concerned category, where they really think that there's the highest belief in global warming. They're the most concerned, and they're also the most motivated to take action. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got a smaller amount in that dismissive category, where there's a lower belief in global warming. They're not really concerned, and they're not really motivated to take action. And so Yale has really taken this information and the results from their public perception surveys that they do on global warming across the US, and put all of that information into these downloadable maps. And so thinking about that national view, I just wanted to pull out some of the different perceptions and beliefs and share some of those with you. And so you can see that 70% of the US thinks that global warming is happening. However, we're closer to 50% when it's caused mostly by human activities. And then there's also less than that, so right at that 50% line of people who think that scientists think that global warming is happening. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect in our communication in regards to people who think global warming is happening, but those who think that scientists and professionals and managers think that global warming is happening. And so that's showing that there's that communication gap. And then thinking about risk perceptions, you can see that about 60% are worried about global warming. However, 70% are worried that global warming will harm plants and animals. And so again, that has implications for us as natural resource managers for how we're implementing management and really thinking about climate adaptation strategies. And so again, I just always think it's interesting that 69% of the population really thinks that climate change is going to harm plants and animals, which again has those implications for really thinking about climate change and forest management. And yet only 52% of people believe that most scientists think climate change is happening. And so there is this stark gap in how we're communicating about climate change with our audiences and the partners that we're implementing management with. And so these maps are great because you can narrow in down to the county level, and you can compare your county to the state to the national level and really look at what some of those perceptions and beliefs and behaviors are when it comes to thinking about climate change. And so this is just a great tool to get to know some of the different audiences within your county to have a better idea of what their perceptions are about climate change. There was also a study that was done in Canada looking at foresters' perceptions of climate change in 2018. And so I just pulled out a couple of the key questions and results from that survey. But some of the ones that I think are interesting is that you can see when it comes to thinking about climate change having a significant impact on forest ecosystems, the perceptions that it is going to have an impact continues to increase as we move 50 and then 100 years into the future. And so there's a little bit of this perception that those impacts are going to happen in the future, but they're also going to be more significant 100 years from now. And then also thinking about forest practices that are currently being implemented, almost 75% of the foresters who took this survey disagreed that the current practices we're implementing on the ground are sufficient to face impacts of climate change on forests. And so again, the actions we're taking now are not necessarily going to address those impacts that we're thinking are going to have a significant effect 100 years into the future. And so this again shows that we just need to be creating and designing new forest practices to deal with the impacts of climate change on our forests. And so there's a lot of different resources out there and research looking at different audiences and perceptions and awareness of climate change. And so it's important for us to really figure out who our audiences are, what they perceive, believe, and value so that we can really be tailoring our messages about climate change to them. And so again, knowing your audience and connecting with their values is really important. So if they love outdoor recreation or they really value the aesthetic benefit of their forests in the fall, these are all things we want to know about the audiences we're communicating with and really listen to what are the things that they value on the ground when it comes to the ecosystems that we're managing for. And so appealing to the values really helps us recognize our audiences and create climate change is an issue that's really personal and meaningful to them. And so we want to connect with something that they really care about. So if they're passionate about wildlife, maybe we want to talk about how climate change is going to affect local bird populations. And there's resources through the Cornell Ornithology Lab and the Climate Change Bird Atlas that we can tap into. Or maybe our audience really loves winter sports. And so being able to talk about how climate change may reduce opportunities for skiing or snowmobiling or snowshoeing will be really valuable and really help make climate change an issue that's meaningful to them. And so we also want to focus on self-transcending values. And so this is where we're considering oneself as an integral part of the universe and thinking beyond oneself, such as leaving behind a better future for our children. And so really thinking about these self-transcending values in our communication can help us think about a wider world view about the future of the ecosystems we're managing, and versus when we're thinking about the bottom line of potentially making money is just thinking about oneself and our needs, but thinking about the health of the forest is really that self-transcending value and can resonate with a lot more people when we're communicating about climate change impacts. We also want to make sure that we're making local connections with local observations and impacts to help reduce the distance issue when it comes to communicating about climate change. And so distance comes from thinking about 3 different spaces. So one, distance in space, and that climate change is not happening here, it's happening in the Arctic where the polar bears live. 2, distance in time, it's not going to happen now, it's going to happen 100 years in the future. And 3, distance in species, it's not happening to us, but it's happening to the plants and the animals. And so polar bears have really been that poster child for climate change, but they really create that distance issue where we're thinking about, oh, it's not happening here to us, it's happening in the Arctic, the ice isn't all melting yet, and I'm not a polar bear, so I'm concerned about this, but I don't need to take action now. Whereas if we really make some of those local connections that are specific, we can instead help influence behavior and really talk about why we need to be taking action now. And so introducing those specific local impacts and changes for audience places helps close that distance issue and move from concern to local action. And so instead focusing on something like, In Illinois, we expect within the next 20 years to see a 10 to 20% increase in these large, heavy rain events, which is really going to have a large result in the amount of soil loss that we're experiencing. So again, really knowing who our audience is and making those specific local connections is really important. And those are some things that you've been doing as you've been researching those local impacts from climate change, looking at some of those regional impacts for your project area in the adaptation workbook. Another way to make impacts more specific and to connect to local audiences is to really scale down well-known disasters into those local impacts. And so this might seem counterintuitive because we're usually told that individual weather events cannot be attributed to climate change, but talking about climate changes that may make extremes more common and how that affects our communities locally, and really thinking about the mechanics behind those large disasters can again help us make those local connections. And so thinking about how maybe warmer ocean temperatures are causing more hurricanes that we're seeing on the East Coast, and the oceans are projected to continue to warm, or we're seeing a lot of these longer fire seasons and longer growing seasons and hotter temperatures and more drought, and so we're more likely to experience some of these large fire events that we've been seeing in the West. So again, focusing on how coming together as a community can help us overcome some of these challenges by really thinking about those climate adaptation strategies. And so what can we do to make these impacts less severe the next time around? And then when we're being specific about our local impacts, we can list them as multiple reasons for implementing adaptation strategies within our climate change plans. So maybe we want to increase the diversity in our forests and to reduce the risk of impacts like pests, diseases, and warmer temperatures. Or maybe thinking about all of those local impacts of disasters, we may want to reinforce some kind of infrastructure to reduce the risk of damage from hurricanes, flooding, and sea level rise. And so again, we can show that the benefits of one idea can really help reduce the severity and the risk of a bunch of different impacts, including those related to climate change. Okay, so we're connecting with our audience, we're learning about their values, and we're making it specific about local conditions and impacts, but we don't want to get bogged down in politics. And it's really easy to say that climate change is about science and not a political issue, but it's very often made into one in reality. So we can use some tricks to engage everyone in the climate change conversation, regardless of their political affiliation. And so we've already talked about local connections to impacts and how that helps people across the political spectrum have greater support for policy action. If we talk about big impacts like fire and drought and the mechanics behind them, that can also help us bridge the divide. And so again, talking about values and themes that resonate widely with everyone, such as doing climate adaptation strategies creates more jobs, or we're going to have beautiful forests, or we're really protecting the places that we live and recreate, and can help resonate with everyone and bridge that divide across the political spectrum. And then if we don't want to make climate change a political issue, we don't want to rely on politicians or the media to communicate about climate change. So we want to make sure that we're using trusted messengers who use simple, clear messages that are repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And so depending on who our audience is, maybe we want to bring in health professionals or faith networks or some of those outdoor recreation organizations to really be those trusted messengers who are communicating about climate change. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're empowering our audience by focusing on solutions and benefits. So we don't want to focus on the doom and gloom of climate change. Instead, we want positive and productive messages. And so if we emphasize the terrible fatalistic aspects of climate change, it's going to make people feel really helpless and disengaged. And instead, we want to make people feel like they can do something about climate change, such as maybe planting future adapted species, and reforestation efforts is something you can go out and volunteer to do today. So we really want to change our mentality towards that I can do it perspective with examples, ideas, and steps that our audience can personally do locally to really empower that action. And so again, focusing on those benefits and solutions and that I can do it attitude. It might seem overwhelming to provide some of those specific examples of benefits and solutions, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. For example, you've just gone through this adaptation workbook process and now you have this list of climate change impacts for your project area. So maybe something you're thinking about is intense precipitation is increasing. And so maybe it makes sense to invest in best management practices that will help reduce soil erosion as an example. And then those could include planning harvest to avoid stream crossings or steep slopes and wetlands. Really thinking about the timing of our harvest operations, or maybe we want to implement infrastructure that diverts water off of roads and skid trails. There's a bunch of different strategies and tactics that you've also been coming up with for thinking about these impacts for your adaptation workbook. And so again, having a bunch of those specific local examples for taking action and really providing those benefits and solutions is really important for being able to encourage people to take those positive actions when it comes to climate change, and also help you communicate your message for why you want to implement the specific adaptation strategies that you're deciding to do for your project. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Danielle, and she's going to talk about how it's really important to effectively communicate using stories and how you can tell your own adaptation story based on all of the work that you've done in the adaptation workbook. So as we're switching over, does anyone have any questions?
We're gonna try to leave a little bit of time in the discussion section to talk about communication. So if you do have questions, or if you just want us to elaborate on something that we've just talked about, write those down and we can cover them in a little bit. Okay, so thanks, Courtney. We will, of course, give you the slides so you can review all of this information again. I know we're breezing through pretty quickly so that we leave some time for discussion. But this is a really critical component, communication, thinking about how you go from all of that work that you've done in this course and then begin to package it and repackage it and share it with your collaborators. Integrate it into your grants and your proposals, and most importantly, share your story, because everyone wants to know, how are you thinking about climate change? Why is climate change important to your management, your organization, and your vision for the future of your woods? So what we're going to be doing is talking about adaptation stories, and part of this is convincing you that you should be talking more about climate change, that you have the tools, you already have the training to do this, and encouraging you to do that. But then part of what I'll be talking about is giving you your homework, because you're going to do this in our course, and it's a low stakes option, but I'll talk more about that. So why is it important to talk about climate change and to tell your adaptation story? Well, just like in everything that we do, when we talk to the people that are important to us, we can gather support for the things that we're trying to do out on the land. And climate change is becoming an even more important concept for us to tackle head on. In addition, it's becoming something, as Courtney pointed out, something that people really care about. So if we can get out in front of this, if we can effectively tell people confidently how we're connecting the dots between climate change impacts, the lands that we care about, and our actions to respond to those impacts, we're more likely to continue garnering support institutionally and maybe financially. We've been part of several different grants that, once we throw in information from the adaptation workbook, it really presents a clear path forward, and it has helped us, we think, strengthen our grant proposals and contributed to our success in getting some funding for different projects. Also, more people are thinking about climate change. Climate change is this abstract big idea. So the more you're out there talking about it confidently, probably, you'll have access to a larger audience. More people will want to come to see you and to hear about how you're thinking about this in their local area. This can also be a really great opportunity to share key lessons, because you're going to get out there, you're going to try some stuff, you might fail, and you're going to want to tell other people like you, what those key lessons are. In addition, you may reach some sort of institutional barrier, or some barrier to some access to tools that, if you were to continue telling your story, you could relay those key lessons to people like you and build their confidence in tackling this topic as well. So, what are the Telling your adaptation story can, again, give you an opportunity to not only talk about climate change and how it's, an integral part of the things that you're thinking about as you envision your forest and natural area moving forward, but it's a really great opportunity to hone in on the co-benefits of good management. And that's something that Courtney just talked about in reference to best management practices. I mean, those toolboxes will continue to exist. We know how to manage for erosion. It's a good management, and it will become even more important in consideration of the climate change impacts that are ahead for very certain areas in our region. So, as we continue to communicate and tell our stories, we can always rely on talking about those co-benefits, managing for the long-term benefits and ecosystem functioning benefits of these natural areas into the future. But, this story is also just a great opportunity to tell people how you're getting things done on the landscape as well, and connecting with them when it comes to values. So what makes a good story? I think we all sort of have an appreciation for people who are good storytellers. We're not all born that way. It takes practice. So that's something that is not included in this checklist, but it should always be there. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll feel telling this story. What we feel like is a good story is a process of tailoring your message to your audience. If you're, with an audience of students, you would want to hone in on very particular vocabulary that would be more accessible to students versus professionals who are thinking about natural resource management. As always, follow a logical sequence of ideas, and to your benefit, you've used the adaptation workbook, which is a logical sequence of ideas going from goals to risks and vulnerabilities, challenges, all the way to what are you going to do about it, expectations for adaptation responses. We want you to continue to be clear about intentionality. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is it important? Can you connect it to the risks and the vulnerabilities? And if possible, can include specific details while also, creating and charting out that bigger picture. So the example storyline that we would share is, centering in on place and purpose, highlighting key risks from climate change, adaptation actions that can help to address these key risks and those potential outcomes and benefits. So, this is a great story. This is a great pitch. This is a good logical sequence and a framework for a good pitch, but it should feel familiar to you because it's all the things you've been doing over the last few weeks in how we've helped you break down how to think about climate change and its relevancy to the place that you're working in. So you are totally equipped to tell your climate adaptation story today. And that's good. That's great because you're going to next week. So next week, we are going to ask you to create that pitch, to go through your adaptation workbook, to pull out these key ideas from step 1, place and purpose, step 2, and step 3, your key risks and challenges and opportunities from climate change, step 4, your adaptation actions, and sort of the bigger picture. This is your vision. And I'll go through what all of that will look like. Don't feel too overwhelmed. You will have only 5 minutes to share your story, and this is just so that we can ensure that everyone has an ample amount of time to share their story and then answer some questions and answer questions at the end. This is about, a minute per slide. Somebody will be in the chat box letting you know when you're approaching your 5-minute mark. And if we have extra time, we'll just give you another minute or two. But what we're trying to get you to do is simplify your entire story down to something that is more of that elevator pitch and really focus on telling a story. So not every detail of your workbook, but really hone in on why is this place important to you? What's at risk and what are you going to do about it? We want you to use this opportunity to get creative. So, you've got lots of time to think about how you can visually represent your story, maybe old Bob Ross style, or you can just cut to the meat of it and show us some maps. Whatever you want to do, but we want to see more than just text on the screen. What we'll be doing after this class is following up with a link to some PowerPoint slides, and we'll ask that you download those slides, and you can reconfigure the slide deck so that you can delete the boxes or whatever. But what we want you to do is fill in these slides with the essence of each of these ideas. So we'll give you 5 slides, you can fill them out how you want, and then you'll present those slides. But here's the big ideas. So for slide 1, we'll have you establish place and context. Where are we? What are we doing? Well, what's your project? Why is this place special? What are the values? What made you bring this project to this course? Next, we'll have you sort of mash step 2 and step 3 into this overarching story of, what are those huge climate impacts that are most important to your story? Knowing that you probably filled out more than 2 to 4 climate impacts, but hone in on those key risks, those key vulnerabilities and climate impacts for your area. Next, we'll have you talk about adaptation actions. And this is where you connect, your place and context to your climate vulnerabilities to talk about why are you doing what you're going to do? Why is this action the right action in consideration of the impacts and challenges that you just addressed in the slide before? This is also a really cool place to talk about new and different approaches to maybe a typical management strategy. How are you tweaking what you're trying to do? Did you come up with something completely new and different? Or do you have like maybe an addendum to the work that you're already planning because of this process? Make sure you highlight anything that's important. And lastly, you'll have an outcome slide. This is the slide that hits on what is it that you're trying to achieve by working on this project, by thinking about climate change. For many of you, because you're thinking of reforestation projects and you're thinking about managing landscapes into perpetuity, this outcomes box really hits at, why was this important? What is that big long-term picture that you're trying to achieve? So again, we will send a link to all the PowerPoint slides so you can download them. And we will also send a link for a Google Drive folder where you can upload those presentations so that we can collect all of them. First, what we'll ask you to do is sign up for the presentation. We've sort of cut out some times during this time, this morning section that we're currently in addition to an afternoon time slot. So, you can choose whatever time you want, be first, be second, whatever it is that you want to do. But definitely let us know where you're at and please upload your presentation slides as well. Your assignment for next time, finish your adaptation workbook. There are some of you who are completing the adaptation workbook in like a paper Word version, and that's awesome. Keep continuing with that, but let us know, email us, let us know if you're done with it, and then show it to us. We would love to see it. For those who are using the online adaptation workbook, please finish that up to the best of your abilities before you do your presentation so that you can summarize your project. Use that information to integrate it into the PowerPoint slides and then upload those PowerPoint slides to the Google Drive. For anybody who is really interested in climate change communication and wants to read more, we have included links to different other resources that we think are really interesting. And we'd love to have a side conversation with you about climate change communication if that's something you're really passionate about. And then the last thing that we're going to be bothering you about, especially after last session, all 3 of our facilitators and instructors for this course walked away with an impression that you guys are all amazing and that you have amazing projects, and we really, really, really want you to share your story on our website. We think that each of you has just exceptional projects. So we're going to not only encourage you to finish your workbook, but we would like to work with you thereafter to cut and paste some of those ideas from your workbook into our online demonstration project summary, which is a much shorter version of the workbook you're filling out that just helps other people like you learn about the work that people like you are doing. And maybe they'll find some strength and some confidence to do the same thing for themselves. Okay, so looking ahead, next week we will be listening to your stories and seeing your presentations, and we're super excited about that. So please go ahead and sign up. We'll send links to the sign up sheet, and we're really excited. So before we hop into discussion, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask?